Hello, and welcome to the SportsPro podcast. My name's Sam Carp, and I'm the features editor here at SportsPro. And what you're about to listen to is a session from SportsPro Live, which took place last week at London's Kia Oval and saw more than 1,000 people attend across the 2 days. Over the course of the event, we heard from the likes of Michelle Kang, The 100, Surge Sports Investments, the NBA, Google Pixel, Angel City, Sky Sports, and the British and Irish Lions. But we closed out the conference with a session to mark 5 and a bit years since sport came to a halt because of the coronavirus pandemic. From fake crowd noise and cardboard fans to the European Super League and bubble tournaments, we picked out some of the things we liked and disliked about sport during that period, deciding what tested positive and continues to have a good influence on sport today, as well as deciding what wasn't so great and would probably be better left in lockdown. The conversation was steered by SportsPro Motorsport writer Cian, who is also the host of the Blackbook Motorsport Mike's Out podcast, and I was joined on the panel by our content executive Elena Kouyoufa and editorial director Michael Long. So let's listen into the conversation now.
Hello everyone, welcome to this session. I hope you've enjoyed your 2 days at SportsPro Live. This is going to be a look at how the sports industry has changed in the years since COVID. Obviously, 5 years and 1 month since the pandemic. A lot of changes since then. We're going to be taking a look at the good, the bad, and the bizarre evolutions since then. I'm welcoming on stage SportsPro's best and brightest, of course, for this session. Mike, obviously you as editorial director have been, sitting across the sports industry for a very long time. So I thought it'd be good for you to intro things a little bit and take a real top line view of the big evolutions that have come since COVID.
Okay, I'll do my best. Yeah, I think, firstly, COVID didn't quite kill SportsPro's magazine, but we no longer do a magazine. So that's one major shift for the industry. Everything that's happened with print publishing, gone are the days that this would arrive through our post boxes and smell delicious. And we would approach it with some trepidation because you'd probably read it and see a glaring typo immediately. So I always vowed never to read a magazine once it's gone to press. But I think one of the big shifts that we tracked at the time was obviously, you cast your mind back to spring of 2020, I think it was about as sunny as it is now. A lovely time of year as it was. But really, when everything ground to a halt and everything stopped, the pandemic kind of really focused minds within the industry in a way that it hadn't kind of done previously. And it was really a unique time if you cast your mind back. A lot of talk of kind of being strong for each other, a lot of talk of solidarity and togetherness. That was the kind of overarching messaging. And everyone within sport was kind of keen to assert sport's social value and kind of bringing people together. Suddenly there was no sport and everyone was missing it from their personal lives. Everyone in the industry obviously was hugely affected as well in their working lives. And so the need to kind of bring people back together again was very clear. And it was this time of need, I think. There was, if you recall, like government bailouts, businesses collapsed, they were in jeopardy immediately, revenue dried up overnight. There were rescue packages, furlough schemes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that prompted people within the industry to think about things in a kind of new way and really start entertaining some kind of big ideas, which we covered at length in the magazine. Actually, Owen, former magazine editor, who sat in the crowd today, wrote some fantastic work for us around this. But there was kind of all this talk of reform off the back of it and new governance structures, new financial structures, how you can redistribute wealth. There was kind of these big ideas coming to the fore quite quickly, which is really quite interesting. And people were just kind of seemingly willing to kind of tear up the script and start again, which I really quite liked at the time because it was quite refreshing. No one had ever covered things like this in the industry. It was completely a unique time. I think Project Big Picture in English football came off the back of it fairly early. It was probably early 2021, I think. It kind of accelerated talk of mergers and things like that in sports like tennis, even though here we are today and I don't think that merger has come to fruition. They had the Live Golf, PGA Tour stuff off the back of it as well. So there was kind of just a lot kind of happening and these kind of tectonic plates underneath the industry all kind of shifting. And it was a really interesting time. I don't know what you guys think about that from that perspective, but there was just openness to new ideas at the time, which I really liked.
Yeah, there was this openness, I think, and then it just felt like nothing happened. That was kind of from my perspective anyway. I think a really good example of it now is like this. If you look at football specifically, like this new deal for English football, and you spoke about Project Big Picture, and there's all this stuff that's kind of all of these ideas that have rumbled away in the background on the back of COVID about that redistribution of wealth. And I can't remember the first time we covered this new deal for English football, but it just kind of showed that once everything got back up and running, it felt like all of that kind of talk was a little bit for show in a way. And once things do start again, people do have their own interests. it is kind of like a matter of survival. And I think that's definitely played out in that regard as well. And I suppose the other thing that we saw and can probably come on to is kind of investors start picking off distressed assets. I think rugby is one that comes to mind a lot. CVC, rugby seems to be constantly getting links, and I just don't know if any of those deals have worked out. I don't know if there are any that you guys can think of that have led to sort of real meaningful change on the back of them, whether that was just kind of an opportunity that those, kind of, I think they were described as sort of vultures at the time, weren't they?
Vulture capitalists.
Vulture capitalists, yeah. And the way that worked out. So, yeah, I think a lot of those kind of big ideas that were floated at the start didn't necessarily come to fruition.
Yeah, in amongst that chaos at the time, I think there was this kind of opportunism that kind of reigned within the industry, and a lot of venture capitalists, private equity that is seemingly emboldened by these distressed or desperate assets. People looking for money because revenue had dried up and were open to discussions that perhaps they weren't previously. CVC made several moves, I think. I've got a few listed here: WTA, Six Nations, various leagues in European football. The Saudi PIF obviously acquired Newcastle and has made numerous moves over the last 5 years. There's the rise of kind of multi-club ownership in football as well. There's been a huge acceleration and growth in the number of groups that have acquired multiple teams, including City Football Group, I think, were a kind of prime example of that. And then over in the US, the major leagues kind of relaxing their ownership rules and actually being more open to private equity and sovereign wealth and basically institutional investment of any kind coming into it. So yeah, there was a hell of a lot of movement, I think, new investment coming into the industry. At the same time, the industry was just kind of bits of it were being sold off and spun off and carved up. You see what Barcelona did to kind of create some liquidity and just kind of sell off bits of themselves in various ways. New commercial units being opened up by international federations. Some pretty creative accounting and things going on as well within some clubs, mentioning no names, but just looking at new ways of raising capital in amongst that chaos. I think it was really quite an interesting time. And we'll come on to sponsorship and things like that, but some dubious sources of cash coming into the industry as well, I'd say. And not too much due diligence being done, seemingly.
Of course not. And obviously that's quite a top line view of the investment side, but there was a lot of positivity that came out of the COVID pandemic, namely in women's sports. Eleanor, I'm going to be coming to all of you throughout with your various likes and dislikes to have come from the COVID pandemic. But Eleanor, specifically on women's sport, what do you think that did for its momentum?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there are a few dislikes that it did for women's sport, quite a few. But I think the main thing I kept from COVID was how much authentic storytelling and athletes becoming kind of influencers of their own, but in a very authentic way, not that kind of supermarket shopfront kind of thing that we see from the typical influencer, but a very authentic way of promoting their sport, engaging with their fans. And I think that has really reflected in today's way of activating fan partnerships, sponsorship deals, not just for their own brand, but also for their clubs and so on. You see a lot of female athletes have way more followers than their clubs or organizations or governing bodies have. And that's just a testament to what they have done and how they have invested in themselves. And I think it's important to remember that, broadcast TV, the primary way of getting sport to fans and to people, is a one-way communication. It's a one-way push of the sport. And then when athletes come in, they have a different opportunity to do that. And I think female athletes have been very good at having that two-way communication. I think also it's an opportunity to humanize athletes. We've always had, athletes be like, wow, they're something, you can't touch, they're untouchable, which does kind of go into the narrative of sport. But again, having that two-way communication and giving fans access to them, I think has been incredible. I know we featured Livy Dunn in one of our 50 most marketable athletes. She's an athlete who now is a former LSU gymnast who has never been to the Olympics, but because during COVID, she did so much on putting Gen Z kind of humor and gymnastics videos and so on TikTok, she grew such a big fan base, and she became one of the highest paid gymnasts at the time without even having an Olympic medal. And then we've obviously got stars like Elena, who I'm pretty sure most of you would have heard of. She did a lot, and she's spoken a lot about how it was a very tactful move leading up to the Olympics, and then obviously what she's done here at Bristol Bears and Olympics coming back to the LA. So I think female athletes have been very strategic and smart and capitalized on that gap they have seen, and I think that has been extremely powerful. And coming on to powerful, you've seen also athletes like Naomi Osaka, who in the US Open, she absolutely wore a face mask covering with a display of different kind of victims of Black allegations and so on that were happening in the US at the time. And I think that was a very powerful move. I think they no longer were scared of putting themselves out there, and they knew what they stood for. Something I want to touch on also is like from a YouGov study that was released recently, where it said that women's sport fans, 61% actually follow athletes, and that's the reason they tuned into sport. And I think that number goes to show like it's over 50%, it's 61% of females who actually tuned into women's sport because of athletes. One more thing to touch on about women's sport is how much awareness around mental health came into play during that time. Obviously, COVID was a very tough time for everyone, and especially athletes who navigate a very stringent program. It was hard to get into training facilities, didn't have their normal routine, games, and so on. We saw athletes like Simone Biles who spoke about her issues, and I think it was the first time that we really understood that athletes are humans, athletes face the same issues as us. They normalized it. Again, Naomi Osaka, I think it was in the Roland Garros tournament, where she said, I don't want to do a press conference, and that's fine. And I think she had actually said that it would be good how we have sick days. Athletes should also have some form of like sick day and say like, I don't want to do this press conference. Like, I don't want to be in that situation. You know, we also had others like, you know, Michael Phelps and so on. Like there are lots of male athletes who also had a similar experience. But I think it was a real moment to see that it's okay. You can be a human. You can have your own struggles. I think for me, those were the main likes and things, you know, we should be taking forward. And I think they have been done to a great extent. And these athletes continue to propel that movement and continue to be advocates of that. And it's so important because COVID wasn't the only reason that they were struggling mentally. There are other stressors in their careers and in their lives. And I think a lot of reform has actually changed, and organizations and governing bodies have been very aware of that impact. So I think those would be my two likes of stuff we're keeping. That tested positive, as we said, in terms of what happened.
Yeah, tested positive being the positive assessment of our topics on stage. I think leave it in lockdown for the negative. We'll get through some more. And I think your last 2 points there about Naomi Osaka and Simone Biles, they tie into, I guess, a wider rise in purpose-driven marketing in all of sports. And Sam, you've got your finger on the pulse when it comes to sponsorship and marketing in sports. What was your assessment of that rise in purpose-driven marketing?
Yeah, I've actually gone back and forth on this one. I think it was a good thing at the time. Obviously, it was something that brands had to do. You know, it wasn't a time to be selling products. It wasn't a time to be making a lot of noise about their sports partnerships. It was a time to be kind of reallocating in that regard, showing their support for the community. And I think, yeah, they kind of, as Elena speaks about as well, it was also a time that, you know, athletes were standing up as advocates, and there was quite a lot of research being published around, you know, consumers wanted to see brands now standing for things that aligned with their values. So yeah, we saw like a ton of purpose-driven marketing, not just kind of, yeah, in that broader space, but in sports as well. And kind of some of them tried to carry that on. But I think what maybe I dislike a little bit about it now is that it's filtered out the ones who are doing it for the right reasons to those who are doing it maybe for show. We've seen it a little bit in the last few months, especially since Donald Trump's return to office in the US, and he's kind of started this war on woke, and quite a lot of companies who had kind of introduced new DEI policies have scaled back on those. So yeah, it was an interesting one at the time to see the brands who, you know, were pushing on that and now pulling away from it. But I think we've also seen like an evolution in what purpose marketing is. I think it kind of sometimes gets conflated with cause marketing and standing up for something specifically, whereas I think what it's actually forced brands to do is think about what their purpose actually is, kind of come up with brand personalities in a way, and be a little bit more creative in how they tell those stories, rather than just necessarily trying to shove products in your faces all the time. It's like a little bit more creative in their advertising and that kind of stuff. But yeah, that was kind of what I took away from that period.
Mike, would you test positive for purpose-driven marketing?
Yeah, I think there was some good messaging. Brands obviously were very keen to talk about this stuff at the time, and that was a kind of moment in time. As Sam says, I think there's been an easing off, I think, a shift in that focus. And, you know, naturally, I think, you know, as time passes, I think that is naturally going to happen. But in particular, in that time, there was obviously a lot of focus, as I said before, on that kind of feeling of togetherness and solidarity, and all of these issues that were happening whilst people were kind of on lockdown, you know, their freedoms restricted and were confined to their homes. Brands had to tell their stories in different ways, and they could appeal to people in different ways and things. But yeah, I think definitely from a social perspective, I think that lives on. And sport is a people business. It's fan first. It's very audience focused, and that's where the messaging goes, or that's where it's targeted. From an environmental perspective, if you think about purpose in that perspective, I think there's been an easing off. Like people were keen to talk about it just a few years ago, and now there's been an easing off, and environmental sustainability doesn't seem to factor in. I think it's more kind of commercially minded executives now. Would anyone agree with that? That people have eased off on the environmental sustainability angle?
Yeah, I would say they have. I think there's a different maybe narrative in how they say it. I think it's always important to consider that sustainability covers lots of branches, and for sure I think environmental sustainability has one of the ones that they've been tactful in how they approach it. So I think it's still being done. I think some people have done a really great job at being very proactive and mindful about how they approach it. But I do think there have been organizations that have been very tactful in how they approach it.
Yeah, tactful, or maybe just a bit hollow, or a bit kind of lofty in their promises and things. And ambitions have been scaled back and things. I think, again, that's reflective of what's happening in the US and among major corporations and governments and things.
Yeah, on that environmental one as well, I think I've said this to you before, Mike. There are some organizations in sport as well who kind of talk about environmental sustainability a lot. I mean, Cian, you know this from covering F1 all the time, and they often aren't really necessarily held to account, whether it's some of the partnerships they go into and that kind of thing. And I wonder how much, consumers care enough to sort of take notice of that kind of thing and pull them up on it. And I'm not sure necessarily it's kind of the consumers or the fans' job to do that and to challenge them, or maybe they are. I'm just missing it. I'm just not looking in the right places. But it feels like sports feel like they can get away with it in a way and make it less of a priority, as you were kind of saying there.
I feel like this is getting quite heavy going now, isn't it? Should we lighten it up a bit? I mean, there were some plainly kind of ridiculous terms that came out of COVID, like phygital. Are we still using the word phygital? Is that allowed?
Has that still been used?
A kind of hybrid between physical and digital activations, or whatever it was.
I have not heard that used in a while, so I'd say that's probably...
We'll leave that one in lockdown.
That's been left in lockdown.
Yeah, sorry for digging that one up.
Although I was going to come back to Sam on the point of environmental sustainability very quickly, because it ties into, I think, the rise in NFTs and crypto that we saw in the wake of lockdown. A very interesting sponsorship category, Sam. The picture behind you, a very nice rear wing from an F1 car covered in NFTs. F1 particularly has had a considerable rise in cryptocurrency sponsors. But what was your general feeling towards that particular sponsorship category?
It's not even just like crypto, because I think crypto has become like part of, it feels like it's reemerged a little bit over the last year, and we've seen like a similar thing that I was talking about before in terms of those who are actually authentic in the purpose space, and then now in the crypto space we're seeing the ones who actually can see out their contracts basically and pretty much just filtered out the bad actors you describe it. But I'd make it a little bit more broad and just talk a little bit about what we saw in the wake of COVID was kind of all of these new propositions being billed as like fan engagement basically. I don't know if anyone remembers fan tokens, and obviously you mentioned NFTs there. No one knew what they were for ages, and it was just kind of this thing that we all said and like looked at, and then eventually like this other it was like, oh, they're fine if there's some utility to them or something. That was the chat as well. And then eventually every sports property under the sun had a sponsor deal with hiatus, which allowed fans to buy fan tokens where they could then vote on things like the color of the team bus and what music the team warmed up to. That just felt a bit grubby, like, I'm not gonna lie. It was a bit odd, and it just felt like kind of monetizing fan loyalty in ways that were basically dressed up as fan engagement. And examples of those fan tokens, for example, what often wasn't articulated was that, like, those assets would like drastically fluctuate in value, and it was ultimately the fans who kind of paid the price, and they weren't really told about the risks. So I think like that's definitely something I think I'd leave in lockdown, is just this kind of like quick cash grabs that came out as a result of COVID. Obviously quite a lot of rights holders were left in a difficult position and sort of driven into making these difficult choices, and that kind of lack of due diligence side of things. But there was definitely a period where I think almost every day we were allocating space on the website to maybe a partnership that had collapsed or a partnership that had been signed with these companies, and at the same time they were kind of being flagged as being quite risky for consumers. But yeah, that's definitely something I'd leave in lockdown.
Yeah, it felt like quite a misguided attempt at fan engagement. I think maybe driven by the confusion of the pandemic, but it's hard to talk about NFTs and crypto without talking about the metaverse, which again was another thing that spawned out of the pandemic, seeing with that phygital, was that the word, Mike? Phygital approach?
That was the word, yeah.
So, Elena, what is the metaverse? Like, what happened there?
I'm not sure I can fully explain what the metaverse is. It's a broad concept, and I think one that hasn't kind of fully come into fruition in terms of like what it is and the purpose it serves. In terms of like what it did for fan engagement, like in my opinion, it's not the ideal way to be engaging in sport. Like I'm not a fan of it. I think it was great for people who were curious in terms of exploring the metaverse and exploring what that concept is. You know, it gave people the freedom to, you know, swap seats in stadiums and create their own avatars, which was probably fun for them, and like engage in sport and, you know, maybe in different sports that maybe they hadn't in the past. But yeah, I'm not sure it like taps into the core fan. And I'm not sure how much teams, I know there still are activations and like, you know, stuff that happens in that field, but I don't think it had that rocket fuel that maybe they were expecting it to have off the back of COVID. So I think it's something that people are still trying to explore. Sports organizations are trying to explore. I think fans are also trying to navigate it and see how it can work for them. So yeah, I think it would definitely be something I would be leaving in lockdown. But I think there was also a study that actually revealed that the game itself may no longer be the primary motivator when you come into the metaverse. So I think that is important, you know, to balance that when you're considering like what is a priority for a sports team, for a sports club. There's still so much challenge out there in finding the right fans and how you understand that demographic of fans. So I think trying to get people in the metaverse would not be my priority. So I'd be leaving that in lockdown.
Yeah, it just felt like there was a lot of tech for tech's sake that came out, you know, post-pandemic. And in terms of things that kind of tested positively during that time, there was some genuinely useful tech around the arenas, around events and the event experience, the live experience. If you remember, there was a lot of tech that was, you know, when you think about cashless, contactless payments, mobile ticketing, just any form of automated access, that was, you know, in that time of social distancing, that was all about safety and public health and safety. You know, it was a really convenient thing. And actually the acceleration in the adoption of that was super useful, it was very efficient, and has outlived the pandemic. And so it should. A lot of rights holders and event operators and venue operators have had to move with the times. And I think that's a good thing. Hopefully you all agree.
Yeah, I was actually looking back at a feature that I wrote, which was about the post-COVID venue experience, and robots didn't quite make the cut, but they were in there. There was also things like, I guess, like wayfinding technologies, which like maybe that actually has been employed in some places, and you just don't actually notice it in terms of kind of, yeah, just like, I suppose being able to remotely control like where people are going, like monitoring that kind of stuff, and that's continued. But I think there's quite a few things that were kind of introduced in that immediate like aftermath of when people were gradually being welcomed back to venues that are then like, have now been like massively adopted. Although Chelsea only this week introduced digital tickets, apparently.
Just this week. Well, there you go. I think also from an event delivery perspective, you know, the remote broadcast production was one of the big things, I guess. And just, I mean, we produce these magazines right here remotely. We did a lot of things remotely, and we continue to do a lot of things remotely. And we use things like Teams and Zoom and all the other stuff that wasn't really a thing pre-COVID so much. So yeah, again, accelerated that for the benefit of the industry and the experience that it produces.
And Sam, a lot of these advancements, if you were, they came from bubble tournaments, which we spoke about just before we came on stage. You're quite a big fan of the bubble tournament, or at least the technology that spawned out of it.
Yeah, I don't know if people remember what these, because like bubbles were like a very like North American thing. I mean, that like NBA did it, WNBA did it, I think MLS did it as well, and there were a few others. And I think WNBA called theirs the wobble, but which don't know if that caught on. But I think it kind of set a really good precedent for like, it kind of reinvented the athlete experience a little bit. There was loads of good content that came out of it. Mike alluded to remote production, and kind of also created these sort of tech-infused venues as well that we're now seeing increasingly more of. So I think like Unrivaled, for example, I'm not sure if anyone's monitored that. It's like a new 3-on-3 basketball league in the States. Has attracted a load of attention from sponsors, a load of investment from some high-profile investors, and that's kind of all done in this one venue. And a lot of the players were likening it to that experience, and it's created a lot of sponsorship opportunities on the back of it in terms of the inventory that they've been able to carve out because of just being in that one place at that one time. And so I think like inadvertently what those bubbles did, even though, you know, I'm not saying I'm all for keeping athletes trapped in one place for 3 months at a time, but I think just kind of some of the learnings from that, and probably some of the things that those sports were able to do in terms of capturing content, the sponsorship opportunities that arose out of it, and just kind of that general athlete experience is something that's kind of filtered through as well.
I do wonder how many athletes would have said that Tokyo was a good experience, though, with, how that event obviously ultimately came together. And then you look at Paris last year and how phenomenal that was. And it was this real kind of return to not just the Olympic movement kind of rediscovering its mojo, but just after post-COVID, major events were back, with Paris and like fully back. And that was a good thing to see, I'd say.
I think it would be remiss of me to not mention the rise of docuseries that came out of the pandemic. Obviously, I write about motorsport on a day-to-day basis, and Drive to Survive is the key docuseries when people think of, breaking through in the sports landscape. A lot of sports have tried to replicate that same effect to little or no success in comparison to the Drive to Survive effect. So I guess for you, how have docuseries really changed that interaction with sports?
Well, Drive to Survive, it feels like it was a kind of solution in search of a problem for a lot of different properties. It was great. It's been fantastic for F1. And, if we had £1 for every time it's been mentioned on our stages and how many times we've written about it, we'd be very wealthy people. But it hasn't worked for all of the other sports. I think for a lot of other sports for various reasons, I guess. But it just felt like, if you're going to copycat that, it's not the most original idea. It's been done before, for sure. I think kind of the concept of a behind the scenes documentary. But generally, I think there was an opportunity off the back of that to really go after a new fan base for all kinds of sports through these new streaming platforms that we're seeing huge growth in subscriber numbers, to get your property out there and seen in a different light, in a different way. If you remember The Last Dance, everyone was talking about it, the Chicago Bulls, Michael Jordan documentary, very early on in lockdown. And off the back of that, there's been hugely successful sports documentaries. And actually, it's a bit of a golden era that I think we're in generally for the sports documentary. But yeah, there has been some ones that haven't landed so well, I guess, as well, in amongst all of that. But I don't know what you guys think. How much do you watch?
Not anymore. Like generally, I don't watch them anymore. I feel like it's done, and I watch behind the scenes content still, but it's only related to the teams that I follow, because I feel like teams themselves now are so upskilled in terms of the content that they're creating themselves. So for anyone on a Crystal Palace supporter, so ever since kind of Saturday, I've been binging all of the content across every single social platform, whether it's Instagram. I've joined TikTok just to see what else they're posting on there. I couldn't get enough. But they're constantly creating their own kind of behind the scenes content now, and that's kind of what I'm interested in. I feel like personally, I think that genre is a little bit tired until someone sort of reinvents the things that we're seeing behind the scenes, I suppose, because it's become so controlled, I think, and I just don't think it's not as authentic as it's kind of like intended to be. I still go back to the best one being the Sunderland Until I Die documentary, because that's a true representation of perhaps what it's like to run a football team, whereas some of the others are just about the glory, I think.
Well, I'm a Southampton fan, and we're, where we are. You're a Palace super fan, though, aren't you? I mean, you're at Wembley. You go often to Selhurst Park, and you also consume all the additional content. I think the documentary has, they resonate with a different demographic, I guess. That's the intention with Drive to Survive, and that was the intention with some of these others. But I guess people just aren't that interested in certain rugby players or golfers or whatever. I mean, I don't know. In the same way as F1 was so inaccessible. When did Drive to Survive launch? 2019?
2019.
Pre-Liberty, it was so inaccessible, and it shone a whole new light on that sport, whereas other sports perhaps weren't so closed off. So maybe that's why it was so successful compared to some of the others.
I think as an Aston Villa fan, I really want us to stop bringing up Crystal Palace on this stage. But Elena, for you, what were the key takeaways for you on docuseries?
Yeah, I think I agree with what was said. I think the main issue is I think a lot of them copied like a similar format. I don't think there was like a lot of authenticity in terms of, different formats, different kind of storytelling there. And I think that's why we've seen a kind of decline in the engagement there. I think it was great in terms of getting new eyeballs to sports properties and athletes. And I think a lot of organizations tapped into what you mentioned, Sam, in terms of capitalizing their own platforms. And we've seen a huge uptake on that. So I think either they have to do something different. What I don't like is I have seen some going into kind of more that reality format, which again, I don't think is the way to go. But I think it does need to have a rethink in how you position it, say something new, as you said, like something athletes aren't saying on their own platforms, maybe think more creatively on that front. But then again, like have more organizations have that feed into their own channels and grow their own platforms. So yeah, I think there was good and bad.
Thank you, Elena. That brings this session to a close. Thank you all very much for listening through this, and thank you, my excellent co-panelists.